Muscle and fat are not interchangeable, meaning one cannot turn into the other. A lot of women will be a little bit scared about adding on muscle mass because of the fact that they have heard people say that their muscle turns into fat, or they have had the experience of building some muscle and feeling like they became bulky because of it. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before, so I won't go into too much detail about it now. But one of the things about building muscle is that when you do build muscle, it builds underneath a layer of fat because we all have a fat layer. So when you build muscle, it builds underneath that layer of fat and then it pushes the fat layer outwards because the fat is the outside layer. So that's what you see more of. So a lot of people, that's why they originally think that their muscle is fat. They think that they're kind of one and the same. That fat curving over the muscle makes it seem like it's just like all muscle, when in actuality, there's just a small amount of muscle under there, kind of pushing it outwards. If we have this belief, then we end up avoiding the very things that build or maintain our muscle mass because of the fact that we're so deathly afraid of the muscle turning into fat. When we stop doing the actual things that are required to build muscle or to maintain muscle, then what happens is that we start losing muscle. And as we know, you hear me say it on every single video, muscle equals metabolism. So when you start to lose that muscle, your metabolism goes down. And what starts happening instead is that your body ends up storing fat. Often what happens when people think that their muscle has turned into fat is either what I said before, where the muscle is building up under the fat and they're thinking like, oh my gosh, all of my fat is turning to muscle, or there's somebody who has experienced building some muscle and then losing it, and then fat being stored and kind of filling in that space. And so they feel like, man, I had all this muscle when I was like younger, or I was an athlete, and now it's all fat. My muscle turned to fat. So when you believe that that's happening, then you end up avoiding the things that are actually going to help you to be able to burn that fat off later, because of the fact that you're stuck in that cycle of constantly losing muscle and storing more and more fat. And then, like I said, that's when it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy, because of the fact that now it seems like it's true. Like, hey, I had all this muscle, I stopped working out, and now I have all this fat. All my muscle turned to fat. That's not really how it happens. So the first thing that you have to understand when it comes to this muscle and fat equation is that they are two totally different processes. So this is the reason why they can't turn into each other. It's like water and oil. Your muscle is full of water and your fat is like oil. So they do not mix and they can't turn into one another. They form two totally different functions. So one is not better than the other or worse than the other. So your muscle is the protein of your body. It is meant to help you to have power and strength and force and endurance. It's what causes your body to move. It's what helps you to stand up and sit down and push something away from you and pull something towards you. That is a function of your muscles, whereas the function of your fat is energy. So it provides the energy to be able to stand up and sit down and push something away and pull it towards you. So they're two totally different functions, but they go hand in hand. The main job of your fat is to store energy. It is a storage and insulation unit. That is its total job. It's going to store that energy for when times get rough, and it's going to keep you nice and cozy. So if you don't have a lot of body fat, then you may experience like chills and things like that because of the fact that you don't have enough to keep you warm. So having that fat is for that insulation. It's insulating your organs. It's insulating that muscle like we talked about before. Like that's why it's that outer layer. So the fat is the insulation and it's also the energy, so that in case of emergency, your body has this reservoir of energy. Muscle, on the other hand, so it's helping you to be able to like pick up your kids and put them down or put the groceries away or something like that. So because of that, you'll often hear me say that muscle is a metabolically active tissue, whereas fat is not. What metabolically active means is that it requires energy in order for it to survive and thrive. In order for it to stay on your body, you have to feed it. Energy is calories. So your muscles require energy in the form of calories, in the form of protein-based calories, especially in order to stay on your body. Whereas fat is energy. So muscle requires energy, fat is energy. So they're two totally different processes. Now, your muscle is what functions for this is where your basal metabolic rate comes from, your BMR, which is the amount of calories that you need to simply lay in bed all day and breathe. Now, I've done plenty of videos about this in the past. I'll link to those below. And if you've ever used the Eat More to Weigh Less calculator, you'll notice that that is one of the like base levels where we talk about kind of your like bed rest calories, your comatose state of calories. That is your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. So your muscle is what determines that. So the more muscle that you have, the higher that basal metabolic rate is, the higher your base level of comatose state bed rest calories is, which means that muscle is burning calories even at rest. That is what metabolically active means. It means that you have to constantly feed it because it's working even when it's not working. So like, while yes, it allows me to move my hands constantly when I'm talking in these videos, it's also working when it feels completely still. When you are laying in bed, your muscles are still doing work. Your fat is not necessarily doing that, because if you are just laying in bed, you don't need energy, and fat is energy. So your basal metabolic rate is going regardless of if you're moving or not. Your fat is you get up and you use that energy. So what happens is that typically when we go into a state of dieting, we're usually trying to get rid of some of that fat. So that's why you're burning calories, you're burning energy, you're burning the fat. The fat is holding on to the calories, and that's what you're trying to burn off. But when we make the mistake of dropping the calories too low, what happens is we start sacrificing what that muscle needs because it's metabolically active. So that is the next thing to really take into consideration and to understand the differences between the two. So because muscle is metabolically active, it's constantly working, you got to feed the machine in order for it to keep going. Your fat is there waiting to be used. Your muscle is just being used the whole time. So it's just doing its thing. Now, because of that, that means that they also require two different things. So a lot of times, and I've talked about this in the video that I did before, where I did a full live session about body recomposition 101 and the holy grail of building muscle and losing fat at the same time, why it's so hard, but I actually talk in there about how to do it. And that's one of the things that I emphasize in there, is understanding that building muscle requires a surplus of calorie and losing fat requires a deficit of calories, because of the fact that what most of us are hoping when we go on a diet is that if I remove some of the calories, now my fat, all of those extra calories that are stored in my fat, will be used so that these fat cells can start to shrink. But what ends up happening is that, like I said, we start starving that muscle. So maintenance allows you to maintain both of them. But once you move into the phase of trying to build muscle or trying to lose fat, you're putting your body at odds of figuring out what it wants to do because of these two different processes. Your body is saying, do you want me to turn the lights on? Or do you want me to turn the lights off? Do you want the air conditioner on, or do you want the heater on? Like you're giving it two different commands at once. That's why it's so hard to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. So when it comes to losing weight, you're going to be in a caloric deficit. You want to lower your calories. When you lower your calories, you are now taking your body out of the anabolic state of muscle building or of trying to maintain it some type of way. So once you move out of the anabolic state, you're moving into the catabolic state, which means now it's eating things up. You know what catabolism is, right? So when you're in that catabolic state, you will lose some fat and you will lose some muscle. The goal is to try to preserve as much muscle as possible while losing some of the fat, so that you don't end up seeing them happen simultaneously and or losing a lot of muscle because of your body having a fear of the catabolic state that it's in and holding on to all the fat. If you trigger that reaction in your body to where it's just like, well, let's get rid of this muscle because it's way too expensive to hold on to, but let's hold on to all this fat because I feel like we're going to need it because I don't know what's happening here. When you trigger that function in your body, that's when it starts to feel like, okay, my body composition, which means the muscle and fat ratio are changing, but not in the way that you want. That's when it starts to feel like your muscle is turning into fat, because the muscle shrinks and then the fat fills in the space, because the calories that you are eating, your body decides to store as fat because it may need them, because you seem like you're about to be in a state of emergency, and it's breaking down the muscle tissue for energy, which is not actually its preferred source. Remember, fat is the storage unit. That is the place where it wants to get its fuel from. So when you force your body to choose, that's when you kind of end up in that self-fulfilling prophecy of seeming like your muscle turned into fat. So the most important thing to remember is that because they are two different functions, because they are two different processes of the body, they require two different protocols for building and maintaining. So whenever you're in a state of trying to increase your calories for the sake of building muscle, there is going to be that side effect of probably adding on some fat as well, because of the fact that you're in a surplus. So anything above what your body needs for muscle building will be stored as fat. So this is why it's really important, if you're on the muscle building side of the equation, to not go crazy and just say, oh, well, I'm bulking like old school bulk, where you just like eat burgers all the time and you're like 5,000 to 7,000 calories over where you need to be, when you only need an extra 2,500 calories to build muscle per week. So if that's what you're aiming for, then you want to stay as close to that number as possible, eating high amounts of protein so that you're building mostly muscle, and understanding that anything that your body does not use for building muscle, it will take over to the storage unit and hold for later, and that is your fatty tissue. So that means that you may build some fat along with building muscle. Now, the same thing holds true when you flip the switch and you decide to go into the fat loss territory. You want to make sure that you understand that now that you're in fat loss territory, now that you're giving your body less calories, that it's going to want to get rid of muscle first, because energy is very important. So you want to be the same way that you want it to not overdo it and not be over exaggerant in your surplus for building muscle. You want to do the same thing. You don't want to be extreme or exaggerant with your deficit when you're in the fat loss phase. So when you move into the fat loss phase, you want to keep a slight deficit with high amounts of protein, so that you're sending those signals to your body like, we do want to, like, let's go into the storage unit and get rid of some things, versus over here in this high budget of muscle that we actually want to keep. So you want to make sure that you're sending all the right signals to your body during that time period, in the way that you're eating, in the way that you're working out, so that your body knows. That's the reason why you will hear me often emphasizing the protein and the lifting weights over, eating whatever you want to eat, like just counting calories and doing cardio. Because those two things, if you're just in a calorie deficit and you're just burning calories through cardio or whatever, you're not sending any signals to your body to hold on to the muscle mass. And then you may be losing weight, but you may not look the way that you want to look in the end. So that should give you a little bit more clarity for those of you guys who were wondering that. I had a lot of questions after the last video about how do you know if you're building muscle or losing fat. That was one of the questions, was, kind of around like, well, I'm scared to pack on too much muscle because I've heard that it can turn into fat. They cannot turn into each other. Muscle and fat are not interchangeable. You do need some muscle in order to burn the fat. But in order to hold on to that muscle, you have to make sure that you're eating and exercising in a way that keeps it. And if you've gone through phases where you've actually lost muscle in the past, then you will need to go through phases to actually rebuild that muscle in order to have that lower body fat percentage in the future. Trying to continually just chip away at the fat without addressing the muscle mass part of the equation is one of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of women make. And like I said, this is one of the myths that kind of stems from, because of the fact that they're worried about either becoming too bulky from lifting weights, or they are concerned about the fact that they just don't they're worried that their fat is going to turn into muscle. So if that was you, hopefully now that is all straightened out and you are still ready to do the things that is required for your muscle building, which is eating a good amount of protein, lifting weights, and not having an extreme deficit when you are in fat loss phases. And honestly, not having a ton of fat loss phases, because the longer that you're in fat loss phases, prolonged dieting is a precursor for muscle loss. So if you're someone who's just been dieting for longer than you can remember, and you don't actually remember ever eating at maintenance, or you never actually like tracked a full maintenance phase, you may want to consider what we call a metabolic reset. And when you go through a metabolism reset, that's just really about taking a diet break, whether it's a short diet break or an extended diet break, where you just eat at maintenance level calories and get your body used to that again before going back into a deficit. That's if you have been dieting for quite some time and you haven't taken a break. If you've been dieting for like years and years and years, the longer you've been dieting, the longer that metabolism reset will need to be, because it's going to take you kind of a slow increase before you get to that place where your body recognizes what maintenance is without packing on a ton of weight while doing it. If you're somebody who's experienced a lot of muscle loss during that dieting process, then you may also want to go through what we talk about as a bulk phase or a muscle building phase. And again, not talking about the old school bodybuilder bulk where you just stuff your face with like burgers and fries and pizza and pies all the time. It's about making sure that you're still like monitoring that intake, eating a sufficient amount of calories, just slightly over that maintenance level, enough to be able to spark that anabolic state again, and making sure that your protein levels are high while working out in a periodized manner. So you want to go through those phases more than you're going through the cut phases if you're somebody who's kind of veered to the side of losing more muscle than fat. Or if you're in that phase where you feel like, I feel like I'm just like getting fatter, even though I'm doing all the things, or I'm just gaining more fat, or my muscle is turned into fat. If you feel like that's happened to you, you probably don't actually have as much muscle as you think. And I would highly recommend getting that checked out and considering doing either the metabolism reset or a full-blown muscle building phase to replace that lost muscle mass. So if you guys have any questions about that, you can post them in the comments. I will also link to other videos that will be useful to you for this particular topic. But if you have been concerned about your muscle turning into fat, you can relax and continue on with your muscle-minded journey and add on the muscle and start increasing that metabolism now. So I'll see you guys in the next one.